Welcome to Cash Plays. And now your host, Bart Hanson.
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Cash Plays. I am Bart Hanson. This week's episode, Goals and PLO. And this will most likely be one of the last weeks that I will be doing the show alone before we get on to some regular guests. It just hasn't worked out logistically coming back from the World Series. But couldn't get Gabe Taylor on this week, but hopefully that will happen next week. And with my learning of Skype and learning how to use recording tools, I think that we'll be able to do remote interviews and interviews, away with guys that just aren't in the area more and more. So we're going to have some guests coming up in the next few weeks. You can leave voicemails at my Skype phone number. I haven't gotten any voicemails yet, and I'd love to test it. 323-743-8404. You can also leave voicemails at 877-836-ROAD. And, of course, send those emails in. We're going to be going over a few emails today. Cashplays@pokerroad.com. Cashplays@pokerroad.com. And you can Skype me at bart.hanson. And I've got like 30 or 40 people that contacted me in the last week. So that's pretty cool. And I look forward to talking with you guys. And hopefully, in a perfect world, I'd love to get a segment going where I can pick, again, a certain part of the week where I can take phone calls through Skype and put it on this podcast. So goals and PLO, the reason why I named this episode Goals and PLO was because I haven't really talked that much about goals and what your goals are in poker and how important they are, I think, to, even write them down or get them mentally, set in your head. And I'm going to be introducing a PLO segment to the show, which is actually one of my goals. And I'll get to that later on in terms of, a goal of mine to play X number of hands online and watch X number of training videos on PLO, because I think that PLO really is the game of the future in poker, and I think that's really where all the money is. Because in a perfect world, I would love to transition to playing online full-time just because it's just more convenient. There are just so many, more money, no gas driving to the casino, no tipping. I just don't think that the no-limit games are in a state where I can play them as profitable as going and playing live. But with PLO, I'm going to do kind of an experiment where I'm going to play X number of hands at certain levels, starting off at 25 cent, 50 cent, and just going to work my way up. And again, going to watch, I'm trying to watch a training video per day over the next couple of months and hopefully just get better and better. And my PLO segment is going to be something that I have drawn from maybe, 5 or 6 training videos that I've watched in between each Cash Plays show. So, the next time that I do Cash Plays, I'll probably have watched 5 or 6 training videos and maybe put in 5 to 10 hours of Six Max online and just bring up some interesting points, about the game. Well, before we get to the PLO segment and some other things, let's talk about goals. For me, I think the most important goal of mine is putting in positive EV hours. Now, I've made a monetary goal in terms of how much money I want to make this month. I'm actually going to England for the World Series of Poker Europe in late September. I'm going to visit my buddy Dave Tuckman that used to do Live at the Bike with me. And then I'm going to go to Oktoberfest after that. So I'm kind of taking about 2 or 3 weeks off from poker. I'm going to play over there and try to get into the tournament, but in terms of the daily grind, I'm taking off. So I'm trying to make quite a bit of money before I go over there. Now, again, for me, if I say I want to make X amount of money, it's just a situation where if I said I want to make this amount of money, well, I don't know how many hours I have to put in. I think in my personal case, it's better for me to say I want to put in 40 positive EV hours per week over the next 5 or 6 weeks. And, we've talked a lot about what is a positive EV hour, because if you're playing bad and you play bad when you're losing, and, sometimes I'm guilty of it, that is not a positive EV hour. I think you really need to get out of there. But I've really recognized how important goals can be over the last couple of years, not just with poker, but with everything in life. And if you can actually write down what you want out of poker, or, what you want to do, if you want to build a bankroll, and then when you physically write that down, it allows you to think about what it takes to achieve that goal. So again, for me, if I wrote down a monetary amount, and this is the most basic goal for this month, looking at my hourly rate, I would say, well, I need to put this many positive EV hours to achieve that goal. Again, for me, it works the other way around. I'm more interested in putting in X amount of positive EV hours because I've got so many hours playing live that making X amount of money is just a variance thing. It's just, if I'm running above or below expectation, and I don't really want to burn myself out. I don't think that I need to make X amount of money per month so that if I'm running below expectation, all of a sudden I got to put in 80-hour weeks. I just would be miserable. So again, for me, positive EV hours is the answer. For you, maybe it is a money thing. Maybe you just, you wouldn't be happy, not making enough money. And I actually know people that have a goal of a money per day thing where if they reach it in 2 or 3 hours, they're out of there. Now, I don't really subscribe to that thought because I think that if the game is good, you should, stay in the game. But some people, when they start winning a lot, they start splashing around and they say, well, once I hit this amount, I'm done because I know that I don't play as well when I win more. And it's just really being honestly with yourself. So, to get those thoughts on paper in terms of what you want to do with poker over this month, this year, and then how to attain what you're trying to do, I think is very, very important. It's a big, big part of the psychological game. Now, I was very proud of myself last night. And, this might be a transformation in the way that I play. Because I've talked about how I normally have two buy-in stop loss when I'm playing live, and these days I'm buying in from anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 in the 10-20 game at Commerce, and yesterday I had bought in for 3. And normally, if I'm down 6, 7, 8,000, I'm done because I just know that the way that I play, I might start pushing a little bit, and once I lose that amount, I'm no longer playing under positive EV hours. Now, the issue with that is, and what I figured out last night, is that actually might be a slight leak. Now, obviously, tilting when you lose big hands is much more of a leak. But if you wanted to play perfect poker and you lost 2 or 3 buy-ins and the game was still very good and you didn't really tilt, well, you really should stay around if the game is good. And that's why I kind of think it was a minor leak of mine where maybe I was setting a definite stop loss and I wasn't necessarily tilting. And the game was still good, but I was still leaving. So last night I was down. There was a guy that started off with $600, which is the minimum buy-in at Commerce, and he ran it up to $23,000. Total donk. Probably had 15 Miller Lights over the course of 5 hours. We'd been playing with him for 5 or 6 hours, and he was just opening every single hand, just calling, $700 all-ins with Queen Deuce offsuit, stuff like that. And I made a pretty high variance play to get myself stuck about $4,000, where this guy had opened for his standard raise, which was 230 in a 10-20 game. Another guy who I know, my buddy to my right, who understands poker very well, re-raised him, and he had been re-raising him a lot, and I thought he was re-raising him, relatively light, and I had about 2,400. He had re-raised, I think, to 6 or 7, and I 4-bet, basically committed myself with pocket 10s. And the donkey had pocket kings. So, that one went down. I was like, well, that's it's a pretty high variance play that I just made. I don't necessarily hate the play. People were like, well, you only have this amount committed, you only have the small blind committed to the hand. Well, yes, but I mean, at the same time, I don't necessarily subscribe to that theory. I think mentally, it's not a terrible way to think that, well, if you've played a hand passively and you've only committed say like a small bet and the guy puts a lot of pressure on you and, you've limped in with, pocket kings and the board comes out, 9-5 deuce and you bet and the guy puts pressure and you say, oh, I've only committed $60 or $70 to this hand. I'm not going to get involved. I don't mind that school of thought, but to say that, well, you didn't have anything committed to the hand, why didn't you just fold the hand? When overall, if that play as a 4-bet shove with pocket tens is the best play, and believe me, I mean, that's the first time. That is definitely the very first time live that I've ever made a play like that because I thought the situations were correct. Because it's not often that you've got a guy who's raising, he's playing donkey aggressive, like super lagtard with no, super, loose aggressive with no regards for the game, just very, very bad. And then you've got another very competent player 3-betting him a lot in position, knowing that his range was incredibly wide. I mean, all those things kind of put it together where I thought that was the best play. When you're playing live, usually, that doesn't come, that type of aggression isn't necessarily rewarded. But anyways, the guy, I stacked off and I found myself stuck about $4,000 and I had lost some other pots too. And then there was a hand where he straddled, the donkey guy straddled, and he had like 21,000 in front of him. Remember, he had started with 600, and I had limped in with pocket kings under the gun, and another guy raised in mid position, and a guy that was on the short stack pushed all in for 800. So it was limp, bump it up to 200, push for 8. Now the donkey in the straddle moves in for 20,000. And by the way, the initial raiser actually had 10,000 in front of him. And I've got kings there, and, certain situations that cases can be made where you can fold kings in a cash game when you really know the players for that type of money. But this guy's range is way, it's just huge. So obviously I call. And, he's got king 10 of clubs. And I've got $3,300 in front of me, and I've got 2 red kings, and he makes a flush. So now I'm down $7,200, but I wasn't tilting. I'm like, this game is so good. This guy's just giving his money away. I'm going to actually stay. Whereas at other times I would leave, but I'm going to actually stay. And I stayed, and I actually won back ended up being stuck about 1,500, I want to say. So I was very proud of the way that night went for me, and just in the sense that I kind of overcame, that stop loss that might have been hindering me making some other money. And I just had a hand where I got it in with an overpair against the guy, and he had, a draw. Like, I got it in with pocket jacks on a 5-deuce-3 board, and he had, just a naked 4, and I was able to, to double back through him. But if I hadn't stayed around, I would have been stuck, again, 7,300. So I'm very happy that I was able to continue to put in positive EV hours after that. So again, that's just, one thing that I might have overcome, and part of my goal for the month. Put in another 3 or 4, again, positive expected value hours. I want to move on and talk a little bit about, I've gotten a lot of emails about people, emailing and saying, well, Bart, you've been talking about protecting your hand, but what about betting to avoid giving away free cards? And it's kind of a complicated issue because, I've talked about not betting to protect your hand. But sometimes if you go back and you listen to the negative equity slow play, which was one of the first episodes that you do, if you don't bet with a hand, sometimes you'll only get action against somebody. If you don't bet or raise with a hand, sometimes you'll only get action if that player beats you with a subsequent card. And I'll give you an example of a hand that I played last night where I had raised it up to isolate kind of a weak, tight, passive player who had limped under the gun. I raised it on the cutoff with ace-9 offsuit, and a guy called in the big blind that's semi-aggressive, and the guy that limped called. So I had ace-9, and the board came out ace-5-3 rainbow, and it got checked over to me. And again, mixing it up, balanced my range. I decided to check. I didn't necessarily want to come out and bet there. We were playing relatively deep and have the aggressive guy, make a check raise. Might have, I'm probably going to bet ace-king, ace-queen there, but I checked behind with ace-9. The turn came another ace. The aggressive guy checked again. Now the guy who usually doesn't bluff came out and bet. He bet the turn. He bet 160. into a pot. The pot was straddled, so, he bet up 160 into a $240 pot. Actually, it wasn't straddled. So now the board's ace, ace, 5, 3, no flush draws or anything like that. I just called. Aggressive guy folded. River was an 8. Now the guy bets 400. I really, really didn't like it because I really can't beat much, and I know that he usually isn't going to fire 2 barrels without much, without anything. And I called, and he had 8s full. So he hit a 2-outer on the river. Now, going back and examining this hand, though, against that particular player that is not likely to bluff without anything, who's not aggressive, I think a case needs to be made on the turn where I can raise to almost control pot size. Now, because I've talked about how, well, if I raise there, aren't I going to get everything to fold? Aren't I going to get everything that's worse to fold and only good things to call? Well, yes, but you also raise for twofold, because if you raise the turn, it prevents him from extracting more value on the river. Now, he didn't actually come out and bet that much money on the river, but it prevents him from coming out and betting a third street with a higher ace. Because if you raise the turn and the guy calls, you could take a free showdown at the river. So that's what we talked about. We talked about betting to protect the hand. We talked about betting to stabilize pot, for pot control, to stabilize the size of the pot. But at the same time, what I basically did was I just called, and against this particular player, he fits right into the criteria that he's never going to give me any action on the river unless he beats me. So he's not the type of guy, whereas, say, if the river came out, a 7 now, he's not going to check call my bet now on the river. He comes out and he bets the turn and I call. He's always going to fold that river unless he hits an 8. So I need to raise there kind of as, to protect against that kind of negative equity slow play. So I'm not necessarily worried about, getting him to fold weaker hands because he's never going to give me any more action on the river unless I'm beat. So, again, twofold, controlling pot size there to raise, not allowing him to again value bet like a 3 aces type hand again on the river, and also not giving him a free card where he's going to give me action. Again, in that situation, only when he picks up a card that beats me. And I hope I've made that clear. And again, because I've talked about not betting to protect your hand, not over betting boards with draw heavy boards, and not jamming pots up because you think that this guy might have overcards or something like that, extracting some value from those types of hands. But there are situations though where you put money in because you're really only giving a guy a free card and you're never going to get any more action unless he hits a miracle to beat you. So I hope that you can kind of see the difference there, and I hope that I made that clear. I had another interesting hand here, and again, we've talked about this, a fair amount, and this is kind of a combination of, a few things that I've gone over in previous episodes about fold equity with draws, and kind of analyzing what goes on in a hand to try to figure out if you should fold the river. And after this hand, there's a second hand that I folded that we can examine. But this is kind of brings a couple of concepts together. I had limped in here. This was a few days ago with Jack 7 of clubs from mid to late-ish position in a 10-20 game. It was the first couple minutes. It was in a must-move game, and it got limped around about 6 ways. So the pot was $120. Jack 7 of clubs. The board came out 10-9-3 with 2 clubs. So I flopped a club draw, a gutter to an 8, and an overcard. This old Armenian guy, donkey, out of the big blind, typical live, nitty, protect my hand. Out of the big blind, he comes out and he bets 220 into a $120 pot. And we've talked about this. What does this indicate? And I've been playing live for a long time, so it's pretty obvious to me. This indicates that this guy has 2 pair. it's just, I've seen it so much that people bet their hands in this way. They wouldn't bet a set this way. You know, they wouldn't bet just a 10 this way. This is almost 100% a two-pair hand. You know, and I was talking to my buddy about this, and he's like, well, should you have called the flop? Now, obviously, raising the flop here is a mistake. This guy had about 1,700 to start the hand. And we're never going to raise the flop with a draw when we know the guy's going to push back and there's no fold equity. All you're doing is getting it in bad. When this guy makes this type of bet, he is announcing that he has two pair. And it's just very, very obvious to me. Now the question is, well, if you call in the club comes, are you going to get any more action from the guy? Doesn't it seem obvious? Well, yes, it seems obvious. But a guy who's a donkey that's got two pair, he's not going to necessarily fold the turn just because a club comes. A better player would, but this guy is a weak player. You could extract one, and you might even extract a small, two bets on the river. So it really becomes a math problem. He bets 220 into a $120 pot. The pot's 340, 220 for me to call. I'm calling 220 to win 340. He's got 1,500 behind. Obviously, if he had no more money behind, it wouldn't be worth it. But, again, I've got 9 club outs, 3 more gut shot outs. So with 1 card to come, I have 12 outs, approximately 46 to 48 unseen cards, 1 chance in 4. I need to get 3 to 1 by the end of the hand if I win. And I hope I didn't go too fast there. But this is how we're figuring out pot odds and range of hands issues. And this is and again, this isn't really even necessarily a range of hands. I mean, I know what the guy has. But for my draw, I need to make 3 times. One, I'm calling the flop. I'm calling $220 on the flop. And I need to make 3 to 1. So by the end of the hand, I need to make $640 total. So when he bets 220, the pot's 340. Okay? So I need to make 660. So I need to make an additional $320 from that pot by the river for me to make this call profitable. Because what I'm assuming is going to happen is if a brick comes off the turn, he's going to make another huge bet, and obviously I'm forced to fold. So can I make that amount? I definitely think I can. I mean, the pot's going to be 340, and I need to make 320. He's not going to fold for a $200 bet on the turn. I think I can easily extract just over a pot size, bet on turn and on the river. So I thought it was definitely profitable. And again, that's how you figure out if you think a guy is going to shove on you in a subsequent street. 12 outs, 48-ish unseen cards, or a little less than that. 1 chance in 4, 3 to 1. Now, the interesting thing that happened was the turn came a 9. So the board was 10, 9, 3, 9, and now he checked. Now, this is indicative of 2 things. He's filled up, or he's gotten counterfeit. And there's more of a chance in more combinations that he's filled up. So if he's got 9, 10, he's filled up. If he's got 9, 3, he's filled up. And obviously if he has 10, 3, he's just been counterfeited. I have the obvious play. I check behind. River comes the 5 of clubs. I make my draw. The pot when he bet 220 into that pot, the pot was about, again, he bets 220 and I call. So the pot's actually 540. So I actually screwed that up a little bit beforehand. The pot was 540 and I needed to extract another, 360. 360 or so. So I thought that was, very, very easy to do. Again, I was winning 340 from the pot, but the pot, when he bets and I call, now is 540. Well, the river's a club, and he comes out and he bets 500. 500 on the river. And I'm thinking to myself, this guy has to be full. I mean, look at the action of the way that the hand worked out. There's no way that when the club comes and he's gotten counterfeit, he's just trying to check that down with showdown value at the end. This is kind of how donkeys and weak players think. When he bets 500 here, he thinks, I just said to myself, he's definitely full. There's just no other way the way that this hand went down. And I folded. And I don't know what the guy had, but it's just, that was kind of a combination of that hand was about hand reading and about pot odds. And, it's just usually you don't get into hands where you have to combine like different concepts within one hand. But knowing thinking what I thought he had, putting him on a hand range on the flop, trying to figure out what it takes, what you need to make when you can really only see one card. Remember, this is on the flop, and you're really going to see one card because you can get bet off your draw on the turn. And then when he checks the turn and the board pairs, he's just got to be full on the river. Now, there was another hand where I had to make a pretty thin laydown too, or a pretty hard laydown, or I had a relatively big hand. And this was at Commerce the very, very next day. The very first hand that I sit down on. And again, this is hand reading ability, another example of hand reading ability. Very first hand, I'm in the cutoff post. I have king 9 offsuit, I check. It gets limped around 5 ways, the pot's 100. The board comes out 10-9-9. It gets checked to me, I bet 7. A guy to my left who I don't know, who's got about 2,000 behind, I started with 3, he calls. The under the gun limper check raises. He makes it 180. And this guy is very tight. I don't think I've ever really seen him make a move. He's not super, super creative. So warning bells kind of started to go off in my head because I looked at him, I was like, if he was in the big blind, he obviously could have any 9. And my 9 could be good. But he's under the gun. So I'm thinking to myself, wow, he could have 10-9, he could have 10s full. Usually guys don't play full houses that fast. Or if he could have ace-9. I think that just folding is a little bit tight. Maybe once in a million years he makes that move because, he knows I'm tight and he thinks that I'll just fold. So I call and see what happens. The guy behind me calls too. Remember, the board's 10-9-9. So now the pot is $600 with the dead money out there. 10-9-9 rainbow. The turn is an ace. Now the under the gun guy checks. He's got about 1,500 left. Remember, the guy to my left has about 1,900 left. I'm thinking the guy behind me checks out of turn. Now, if I was playing heads up against this under the gun guy, I might check that back kind of for a combination of pot control, maybe try to get in to bluff some hand at the river. But because the guy behind me checked behind out of turn, I thought that guy was definitely on a draw, and I wanted to extract value from him. I didn't want to give him a free card. So I came out and I bet 400. The guy behind me folded. Now this guy under the gun, he Hollywoods it up. He's like, oh man, if I call here, I'm going to have to call your all in at the end. And he check raises me minimum to 800. And he's got 700 left. So a check raise on the flop, and now a check raise on the turn. And I said to myself, this guy's he has to be full here. There's just absolutely no way. Even creative players, even if he were to check raise with, say, like Jack 9, if he even came in with that hand under the gun, again, he's a tight player, Jack 9 suited. He check raises 2 guys on the flop, gets called by both of them, now checks the turn, and the guy next to act bets, and the guy behind him folds. There's just no way that guy would ever check raise with Jack 9. And this is sometimes, I think, what the problem with people at lower levels. They don't look at the action of the hand. They look, well, I've got a 9 with a king kicker. I'm going with this hand. I've got a strong hand. But again, if you flip that hand back, there's just absolutely no way that king 9 can be good there. And my buddy was like, well, don't you think you're playing a little bit weak, because I actually showed him a 9 and I said I had king 9 and I folded. But, at that level, players they're not trying to really roll over you. I'm not really intimidated by commerce players that are trying to be, overly aggressive. I just know that was the right laydown. And again, just rolling back the action and just trying to figure out, don't necessarily look at your cards, because in any given situation, it doesn't matter really what you have. It matters what your opponent has. You could have the second nuts. And we've talked about this before. You could have a second nuts on a board. But with what the guy's representing, he either has the nuts or it's a bluff because he would never bet anything less than the second nuts for value. In this case here, this guy, he either had to have a total bluff or he had to be full with tens full, 9-10, or ace-9 because there's just no way that he's going to check raise a worse 9 there in that spot. Moving along here, and again, I said that we're going to start doing this, and this is the kind of premiere of the PLO segment. And again, this is going to be a learning process for me and all of you guys because I am not well versed in PLO. Now, obviously, I have a ton of experience with limit Omaha 8 or better, which kind of allows me to get ahead a little bit at the lower stakes when people are just kind of, trying to figure out to read the boards. And I kind of know how to value bet, when there's 3 of a kind on board. You don't have a full house if you've got top pair. You got to have a pocket pair in here and stuff like that. Kind of simple stuff. So, I've even played it a little bit of 25 cent, 50 cent, and I can see that people actually make mistakes, some pretty elementary mistakes. So I kind of have a leg up there. But, again, my goal is probably to play 4 or 5 tables of 6 max at a time. And in PLO, it's about 60 hands per 100. So, 300 hands an hour, maybe 1,000 hands a week, and watch, 5 videos a week, say, over the next 2 months, because I really think that PLO is the game of the future. And once it starts moving into like the live realm and you can really start playing high, like half and half games, it's just going to be great. And ideally, if I could get good enough, I would just play it exclusively online because it's so much better, than the no limit games. Now the variance supposedly is double, but if you're a good player, from what I've heard, you can win about twice as much. So I've watched about 4 or 5 videos, and this was actually on I think it was on Deuces Cracked, the 7x6, the 7x6 series. And I think one of the most important things that I extracted from the first few videos, and it really struck a chord because I actually played over at the bike the other day, and they have like a small 5-5 PLO game, and I just kind of wanted to feel out what live PLO was like. And what I noticed over there, it's kind of the same thing, difference between, say, 6 max no limit and full ring no limit live. The players are extremely passive. And a lot of the times, the only hands that they're ever raising preflop with are aces. Or maybe, double suited kings or something like that. The same thing can kind of be said at the lower online levels. When you look at a guy's heads up display and his preflop raise statistic is under like 5%. Normally, he's only really raising with premium hands. Now, the point of this is that they basically give away their hand when they 3-bet or when, they raise. If you can play PLO where you're not just raising preflop with those types of hands, you are going to win a lot of money versus players that think that you have aces when you raise your hands. And I'll give you an example. If you were going to 3-bet a lot with your run hands, and what I mean by run hands like 8, 9, 10 jack, king, queen, jack, 10, somebody that might have opened with a hand that wasn't aces, they might now call you and think that you've got aces. And I actually said in the beginning, a lot of people are, they're just opening with just aces. They're opening with some other hands, but I guess the real point is that the 3-betting most of the time is just with aces. So if you can 3-bet with your run hands, with your consecutive, your 4-card run hands, 5, 6, 7, 8, even your one gap, even your double suited, maybe 1 gap run hands, and they always think that you have aces, they're going to be making raises on flops where they think that their equity is great against aces and they think that you can't call if you do have aces. And I'll give you an example. Say you make a 3-bet with king, queen, jack, 10. And somebody had initially raised with queen, jack, 10, 9. Okay? And the flop comes out king, 10, 3 rainbow. Now, if you've got naked aces there without a flush draw, it's very, very difficult, and you shouldn't really call the hand. You know, let's say you throw out a bet there with naked aces and a guy raises, or, you know, he checks to you and you bet and he check raises you. You really can't call with naked aces there. However, if you have a type of hand like, say, King, Queen, Jack, 10, where you've got this remember, he's got Queen, Jack, 10, 9, so he's got, you know, middle pair and a wrap. You've got King, Queen, Jack, 10. You've got top and bottom with basically the same rack. He's got an extra straight out. He's putting pressure on you because he's like, well, my hand is, you know, it's basically favored over aces. There's no way that he can call with aces. But if you show up there with that Broadway run hand, your equity is huge versus his hand. So you're going to have players start making, you know, basically making moves on scary boards with, say, top pairs and gutters, wraps, naked wraps. And if you've got the same wrap plus a pair, or even, you know, a better wrap than they do, you're just going to make a ton of money. So my point is, first kind of, again, PLO strategy segment is, don't limit yourself to 3-betting with only aces or double-suited kings in PLO. Because if you start doing that, you're basically playing your hand face up. And people are rightly going to raise flops when they think they've got incredible equity. And, you know, a lot of times going to be favored over naked aces. And just the semi-bluffing opportunity, even if they only have 45% equity, you know, boards are very hard for naked aces to call. But if you start showing up with 5, 6, 7, 8, and you 3-bet a guy in position, and, you know, the board came out 7, 5, 4, you know, they're going to think twice about putting pressure on a ragged board against you, because your range isn't just high cards when you 3-bet. And again, from what I've seen at the 25 cent 50 level, people's ranges are very polarized when they're 3-betting. So that's the first kind of, you know, tip that I have with PLO. And again, I'm going to try to do kind of a segment on PLO every week hopefully for the next few months, you know, before interviews, and try to tell you guys what I think the best tips that some of these training sites are saying about PLO, and, you know, just things that I've learned as I continue to play, you know, a couple thousand hands a week. With that, we are going to take a little bit of a break, so we'll be right back right here on Cash Plays.
Cash Plays. Previously on Big Poker Sundays.
All right, well, I'm not here to give you advice. Salsa plus dance plus man equals gay, says Adam. All right.
Yeah, not the ones who teach these classes, though. They're not gay. They're flaming
heteros.
Their hands all over the girls, pretending to be gay, putting their hands all over and watching the movie.
Oh, is that the angle? Is that the angle they shoot? They pretend to be gay, and then...
Yeah, of course.
Oh, that's how they win.
And then they do the flamenco.
Yeah.
Then your girl's gone. She's gone. Forget it.
Dancing with the Stars is ruining our society.
Yeah.
For more with Bob and Huff, tune in to Big Poker Sundays every Sunday, only on PokerRoad.com. Cash Plays.
And we're back here on Cash Plays. We're going to get into some emails. Again, cashplays@pokerroad.com. Skype me, 323-743-8404. First email comes from Bart Tickleman from Atlanta. And he says, "Hi, Bart. How about a segment about straddling? I've mostly played online and have relatively little experience playing live. So I would appreciate a description of different kinds of straddle. What I've usually seen is the option first goes to under the gun player who straddled. But the Rio had something called the Mississippi straddle where the button had the first choice. Also, when and how to play a straddle when one has the option. And lastly, how to play against different kinds of straddles." Well, thank you very, very much for that email, Bart. Now, typically in Los Angeles, at every other casino that I know of, they all allow straddles, and a straddle is a double the big blind bet. So if you're playing a 5-10 game, a straddle is to 20 under the gun. And the straddle is live, which means that if it gets limped around back to the straddle has the last action pre-flop. So, limped around a couple ways, gets back to him. He can check his option or he can raise it pre-flop. Now, what they were doing in Vegas was you could straddle on the button. Or you could straddle under the gun. But if the guy who was on the button wanted to straddle, he could, again, we'll use 5-10 because it's easier as the example. He could put 20 on the button. And he had the option. And what it did was it caused the small and the big blind to act first. So instead of under the gun acting first, and that's why there were a ton of times when people were acting out of turn because you're just not used to it, the small blind has the option. They've got to call 20 right away, and then the big blind, and then it goes under the gun and around. Now, if the button didn't want to straddle, the under the gun had the option, and that was it. I'm pretty sure that you could only straddle from under the gun and on the button. And the straddle had the same rules on the button. When it got around to him, if someone raised in front of him, obviously, he can call, fold. If it got limped around to him, he can raise, check. So, again, same types of rules. Other situations you can have, or other games, home games, you can have straddles and restraddles, and they're all live. Where a guy, straddles under the gun +1 can restraddle, under the gun +2 can restraddle, all the way around. And what I've seen, it depends on the rules. Sometimes they're dead, but most of the time they're alive. The problem with those games is that, if you're playing a 5-10 game, and let's say that everybody was deep. Let's say everyone was like 200 to 300 big blinds deep. So $2,000 to $3,000. And now you've got a straddle and 3 restraddles. So 5, 10, 20, 40, 80, 160. Well, all of a sudden you're playing 10 to 20 big blinds deep, plus all the other dead money in there. So, when they have games and people talk about, oh, I love the action, the problem is that when you get straddles and restraddles in there, it tends to, obviously attract more gambling. I like to play with blinds that are smaller with deeper stacks because I think the better players have an advantage. Now, if you're a tournament player, and you kind of understand pushbot strategy and range issues, straddle restraddle games wouldn't be that bad. But I just really think that kind of tends to be like a super gambly game, when you're playing 20 big blinds deep with straddles and restraddles. So I don't particularly like that all that much. In terms of the strategy of a straddle, and we'll talk about the straddle that you'll find at, again, 95% of the places, which is just allows the under the gun straddle. People like to do it because they say they want to add action to the game. I generally find an under the gun straddle to be negative EV. Just because you're putting in more money, obviously, out of position. Yes, you're last to act pre-flop, but you're going to be, one of the first ones to act on every subsequent street. And especially if you're playing against good players that can recognize stealing, because under the gun, it's almost like it's under the gun straddle is almost like it's extra dead money. It's almost like 2 big blind antes. So if you're playing against guys that recognize that, they are going to be raising a much, much wider range from mid to late position. Now, if you want to fight back with 3 bets, okay, fine. But again, you're always going to be out of position. That's why I generally think putting in more money blind out of position is a negative, EV plan. Now, when I think that you possibly could do it is if you're in super weak tight games. And I mean super weak tight games. Because then if you start straddling and a bunch of guys limp, what ends up happening is a lot of the times you're going to be wanting to raise a wide range out of the straddle, like with any ace, because you're going to be able to take a bunch of money down. You've got to identify the guys that are trying to trap you with like limp re-raises with big pocket pairs. But even if you don't raise, say, it's limped around two or three ways and, you check your straddle. If you can understand good board texture issues, trying to figure out, what range of hands the guys have that have limped in out in the field, a lot of times you can just bet and take the dead money down. You see the flop and you bet and everybody folds. It also, one of the advantages is it creates a bigger pot. Because, sometimes you're in those nitty games where the pot's just, people don't make calls. Nitty games, the way that you make money from nitty games are people that are overplaying their hands. You know, a guy sits around and, you know, finally picks up aces or kings, and, you know, you stack them off with 2 pair or a set because he can't get away from it. But a lot of times in nitty games, those guys aren't making negative EV calls. Like, they're not making bad calls on garbage draws or, you know, calling big bets with bottom pair and stuff like that. Especially when the pots are small. So when the pots are small, I mean, a lot of guys just aren't even getting involved at all. So if you start to build a little bit of a pot up pre-flop just by straddling, it allows for some more action. And I guess a case could be made is if the table is not overly aggressive, then, you know, it might even become positive EV. Just the fact that you can get more money in there, and the fact that you can also steal the limpers a lot of the times, maybe by raising maybe the top 20% of your range out of the straddle. You know, something like that. Now, if you're allowed to button straddle, you should do it every time. Button straddling is a huge, huge advantage. I mean, you're putting in money that people have to call blindly, and you are last to act. I actually heard people in Vegas say that button straddling actually sometimes kills the game. Because if you were actually going to play an optimum strategy against button straddling, you know, you shouldn't be limping in with hands from up front. Don't think that you need to complete in the blinds. I mean, yeah, you've got $10 in the big blind, but remember, again, against fairly competent opposition, there's so much more money to steal. So, you know, you're sitting there in the big blind with, you know, Jack 10 suit, and you're like, oh, I'll complete 2 extra chips in a 5-10 game, but you really probably shouldn't be doing that against, you know, somewhat aggressive players at the table. But when you're last to act, you almost have to. I mean, it's such a huge advantage. You should be straddling every single time. You know, and it's kind of a similar thing to when you're playing 3-handed. When you're playing 3 or 4-handed, you basically should be straddling every time if they allow you to. So, you know, you play at a place like the Commerce with the Bike where they only allow straddling under the gun. Well, you're playing 3-handed under the gun. It's on the button. So you definitely should be straddling the button. You know, gets around to you, and now you can really raise with much, much more than maybe 15, 20% of your range. And if you're in a weak, tight game, you might go so far as to raise 30, 40, 50% of your range when you're last to act, especially against guys that haven't been limp re-raising a whole lot. And so what if a guy limp re-raises you, once or twice? But the advantage that you get from being last to act is just, absolutely huge. Now, the third part of that question is, well, how do you play against different types of straddles? Well, against an under-the-gun straddle, from mid to late position, I think that you can be widening your opening range, because remember we talked about, well, no limit really isn't a battle of the blinds, but when you get extra dead money in there, it becomes a little bit kind of like a game like antes. Whereas, I might not get involved in the hand like with a, like an ace-4 offsuit in the cutoff. Well, maybe now I'm bumping it up, to a half pot to pot size raise, especially against a guy that doesn't like to defend his straddle that much. You can also exploit guys that over defend their straddle. I mean, I know guys that straddle and they will call with almost any 2 cards because they've straddled. And they don't necessarily do it in the big blind, like, oh, I need to defend my big blind, but they'll defend their straddle. Just the illusion that there's extra money out there. And on the same token, if you're straddling from under the gun, which is part of the reason why I think this is a negative, why overall it's kind of a negative EV proposition, straddle under the gun, you shouldn't be defending with a wide range. So again, if you're in that spot, and a guy you think might be stealing, yeah, you could 3-bet him, but you're going to be out of position for the rest of the time. Also, if you're in late position against an under-the-gun straddler, you can widen your range and steal. But remember who the type of player is in the straddle, because a lot of times you can take those straddle guys for value town when a guy over-defends his under-the-gun straddle. Now, button straddles, stealing button straddles, boy, it's kind of a different thing, because, if you're opening to steal a button straddle and you've got a guy that likes to defend, again, you are going to be out of position, as opposed to the normal straddle where you're in position, and as you're trying to steal the under the gun straddle, now you're going to be out of position, trying to steal a button straddle. Now, if you've got a guy that's kind of sane that hasn't necessarily been defending a lot of his button straddles, now you start, opening it up with a little bit of wider range from mid position to cutoff areas, because now you're going to have position the rest of the hand. So what's the common thread in this? Position, right? Position, position, position. And again, with the standard straddle, you are out of position, which is usually why I don't like doing it unless you're at an incredibly passive table. So I hope that helps you out a little bit, Bart. Small dissertation on straddling. Next email here says, this comes from Joe Firth. He says, I've logged well, and this is about the discussion about the beatability of low stakes, no limit games, and we've talked about this a lot. He says, I've logged well over 500 hours in a $200 no limit max game near my house. I've logged well over 500 hours in the game and thankfully moved up to 510, and my brother and a good friend both logged that much as well. They don't keep as much detailed records as I do over the course of that time, but my best estimation is I made about $27 an hour. In the interest of science, I did an experiment last week where I kept track of the ratio of money coming onto the table versus money coming off of the table through, say, the drop, bad beat, drop, and tips. I played for 20 hours, and the average amount of money coming off of the table was $155. The average amount of money coming onto the table was $370. That means there was an average of $215 an hour to be won, as far as I understand it. The game would be unbeatable if the players were any good or shy about rebuying, but there is and always have been more than enough people happy to ship in a whole buy-in in with ace jack and rebuy when they go broke. Well, thanks for that email, Joe. And that kind of gives to the point where, I talked about, well, our low stakes, no limit games, again, are they beatable? Now, he didn't say what the blinds were here, but it's a $200 max buying game. He said he beat it for $27 an hour, and I'm assuming he's one of the better players in the game. And it seems to me that he got some good data here. So if you're trying to think about the beatability of a game that you're in, I would suggest doing what Joe just did here. Take a look, take a few hours, look how much money's going down as rake, and look how much money people are giving in tips. And keep track of the amount of money that are coming onto the table through rebuys and new players. And see how much money can be made. Now, he's saying that $215 an hour came onto the table. That seems a little high to me for the typical game. But, for his game, fine. He did the research on his game. I would go so far as to say, as on average, it would be a little less than that. Maybe like $150 to $200 an hour. And again, if you're playing in an 8 or 9-handed game, on average, the amount of new money that could be won if you split it up between everyone, would be, something like $20 an hour. Obviously, you've got to be one of the best players to make that amount because you're taking money from the other players. But the point that I make in this is that, let's say you're one of the best players, you make $27 an hour. At least even when I was like in my early 20s, it would be impossible to build a bankroll up at that level. Because, if you're making $25 an hour, even if you played 40 hours a week, so you made $1,000 in cash, and you played every single week of the month, so you made $4,000 to $4,500 in cash, how much money could you really save? I mean, even as a single guy, even if your nut was like only $1,000 or $1,500, I guess if you made $25 to $30 an hour, you could save $3,000 a month. But I am sure that most people are not in that position where their monthly nuts are that low. Which again is the point where, yes, these games can be beatable. But I don't think that you can ever, take the idea that you're going to be able to move up through the ranks without moving up and taking money from some other source besides poker to, say, move up to 510. So thank you for the email, Joe. Last email of the day. It says, Dear Mr. Hanson, I experienced a difficult situation the other day against a tricky player in a 7-handed 510 game. The villain would check in the dark after flat calling my pre-flop raise. Well, I usually see this as a weak play, where they only check raise with a monster. This opponent seemed to not only balance his range that checked in the dark, but he may in fact have done it more often with his premium hands. How do you battle against opponents who check in the dark? And in what sort of situations, if at all, should you use this? Well, thank you for the email. And this is an unnamed email. I personally, I'll take the last part of your question first. I personally don't like to check in the dark because I've seen too many kind of quirky things that have happened where certain boards come out that I would normally always bet at, where, for some reason, say I flop a monster or I didn't want the guy to check behind. I just think that checking in the dark puts yourself at a little bit of a disadvantage. Because sometimes being first to act actually can be an advantage. When a scary board comes out, you can take a stab at a monotone board and know that the guy really can't call unless he's got one suit of that board. Something like that. In terms of how do you combat a guy that's been checking in the dark, I really, it's kind of a tricky situation. I don't know if I really wouldn't worry about it. I wouldn't worry about it all that much because nowadays, or it's been, for the most part, players almost always check anyways. And they're always checking their monster hands anyways. So by checking in the dark, the only thing that guy's not doing is, I guess, not giving himself the ability to come out and bet kind of with the weakish top pair, which, again, against kind of low stakes, weak players, the only times they're really going to come out and bet is if they're kind of testing you with, like, say, a mid pair or, top pair, a hand that they don't really want to, commit a lot of money to. They're kind of seeing where they're at in the hand, quote unquote. Remember I talked about how I hate that. That's normally what a bet does. So when they check in the dark, they take, that ability out of it. So, I would just ignore it. So they check in the dark, just treat it like a regular check, look at board texture, and try to figure out if, it's a proper type of board to bet at. It's the same type of thing. You're betting for value, betting to get called by worse, betting to get called by draws, betting with air so the guy will fold. The only thing that you might have to do, especially against what seems like an aggressive player in this case, is just realize that when you bet for value, that if he check raises you, a larger percentage of the time his range will be air. So I think, and you don't necessarily know how much, if it's 10, 20, 30% of the time more, it'll be air. But you just got to take into account that a larger percentage of the time it's going to be air. And it was kind of like that hand that I played last week when I checked behind with aces. If you figure that this guy's been checking in the dark, and a lot of the time he's check raising with air, if you're at a low level game and you want to stack off, well then bet so that they can check raise you so you get more money in the pot. If you don't want to stack off with the hand, then check behind and play two streets. It's such a simple concept against aggressive players from up front. There's nothing wrong with checking behind with a good hand that you don't want to stack off with and just playing two streets of pot control. So, if this particular guy, Mr. Emailer, has been check raising a ton of hands and you flop a medium strength hand like middle pair top kicker or top pair weak kicker, then just check behind and play two streets with them. It's the same type of thing. And again, if you flop ace king on a king high board and you think, you know what, I'm going with this hand, then by all means bet and try to induce check raise. And I hope that helps you out. That's going to conclude it for this week. Again, hopefully next week we will have Gabe Thaler on the show. I want to thank everybody for joining us. And we will see you next Wednesday right here on Cash Plays.